Your full screen.
Good afternoon. I'm here today to talk about my recent research. I'm going to talk about how cannabis use interacts with obesity. So last year I published a study, and what I found in that study was that if you include both beneficial and harmful effects of cannabis use, you conclude that cannabis use reduces the premature death rate in the United States. The study was published in IU ScholarWorks, and it's easy to find, free access articles. I welcome you to seek it out and read it. But anyway, when I was working on that study, not only did I show that cannabis use reduces rates of cancer and diabetes mellitus, but also I realized that these diseases are associated with diet, with disruption of metabolism, and with obesity. And so I decided to follow that train of thought a bit further. What we're seeing here is the obesity rates of America. And what we see over here in the early 1960s was we had about a 10% adult obesity rate. And in the years since then, you can see that's been rising markedly, and it's now over 3 times that high. So if we look at individual states, we see that the lowest obesity rate is in Colorado, and even Colorado has an obesity rate that's over twice what the obesity rate was nationwide in the early 1960s. Well, it's clear that people haven't changed during those years. It must be a change in diet. So obesity is a very serious medical problem. It's associated with all sorts of harmful conditions. It's associated with inflammation, which underlies many chronic diseases. It's associated with diabetes mellitus, with cancer, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease, liver and kidney disease, and musculoskeletal disabilities. And these diseases include the major causes of death and disability in the U.S. Obesity is also very resistant to treatment. A lot of people have no luck with trying lifestyle modifications or diets. There's few medical options that are effective and very pleasant. So it turns out that the endocannabinoid system is very strongly involved in obesity. As you know, perhaps, THC is the main psychoactive ingredient of cannabis, and it acts by stimulating a CB1 receptor. This is a receptor that its main role seems to be in increasing energy intake and conservation. So it makes your food taste and smell better, stimulates your appetite, it increases how much calories you consume, it increases the storage of those calories in fat cells, and at the same time it causes you to conserve energy. It decreases your metabolic rate and has a pretty striking effect on that. In the rat, we've found that CB1 receptor antagonists can increase your metabolic rate by up to 50%. So a big change in metabolism. So it turns out that the reason your endocannabinoid system is disrupted by diet leading to obesity is at least in part due to the ratio of omega-6 fatty acids to omega-3 fatty acids. It turns out that these are precursors that are acted upon by the same set of enzymes, these over here, desaturase and elongases. And if you have normal ratios of about 1:1 to 4:1 of these two groups of fatty acids, you wind up with normal levels of our endocannabinoid signals, AEA and 2-AG. These stimulate CB1 receptors, and the amount of stimulation gives us a healthy body mass. But the system is disrupted by our diet. Our modern diet has an extremely elevated ratio. We've got more like 15:1 or 20:1 ratio of the omega-6 fatty acids relative to the omega-3 fatty acids. And so what happens is basically these omega-6 fatty acids overwhelm these enzymes and lead to elevated amounts of the AEA and 2-AG signals. And that, of course, is going to overstimulate the CB1 receptor and lead to weight gain and to obesity. So this diet with this elevated omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids is obesogenic and pro-inflammatory, the very conditions that we see associated with so many metabolic disorders. So, a clinical trial was tried with rimonabant, which was an antagonist of CB1 receptor. So in the face of this skewed omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio, what happens is we've got our elevated signals stimulating CB1 receptor, but we block the CB1 receptor with this antagonist, and the net result was weight loss. So it did allow people to lose weight. However, there were severe psychiatric side effects, and this treatment, this clinical trial, was halted. Theoretically, cannabis should cause an increase in weight gain because cannabis stimulates CB1 receptor through THC. And so you would expect in the face of this diet with elevated signals stimulating CB1 receptor and THC coming in and stimulating CB1 receptor, that people would have increased obesity. But that's not the case. So we see here a couple of legends, and they're not alone. So I looked through the literature to find all the studies I could that report the body mass index of cannabis users and non-users. And every single one of them had user body mass index less than non-user body mass index. And those data are summarized over here. It's highly significant. It turns out, though, that there may be confounding factors that influence this. So, for example, cannabis users more likely to use tobacco. We know that tobacco reduces body mass too. But I also found 6 studies that report what we call an adjusted odds ratio. And what this does is adjust for potential confounding factors. And our odds ratio is basically the relative rate of obesity or overweight in cannabis users divided by the rate in non-users. And so you would see a value less than 1 if you have less obesity in cannabis users, and that's exactly what we saw. All the studies show adjusted odds ratio less than 1. There were also multiple studies which showed dose-dependent decreases. So here's an interesting study from 2005. Warren et al. They took people, and categorized them by body mass index. So within groups. So under 30, 30 to 39, 40 to 49, and over 50, which would be morbidly obese. And they looked at the percentage of each group that used marijuana, and what they found was a linear relationship. The more of the group used marijuana, the fewer of them were obese. And the more of the group were obese, the fewer of them used marijuana. And then these 2 studies showed clear dosage-dependent effects. So here we have a study which shows that even at 1 to 4 times per month, we have a body mass index that's within the healthy range and significantly lower than non-users. The study over here looked at how long people had been using and found that the longer they had been using them, the less likely they were to be obese. And then this study, very recent, they looked at changes in the state's obesity rates following legalization of medical marijuana. The blue line up here is what they call the synthetic control, which was a construct of what's happening in states that did not legalize. And this over here is the states that legalize. And we see a clear and rapid divergence of these states with a significant decrease in obesity in states that legalize medical marijuana. So we've got a paradox on our hands here. So the data clearly shows that if you stimulate CB1 receptor, you gain weight, and if you inhibit CB1 receptor, you lose weight. But we also know that THC acts by stimulating CB1 receptor, and yet cannabis use is associated with lower BMI and lower obesity rates. And currently, there's no adequate explanation for this. So the key observation to understand the data is that when cannabis is used, CB1 receptor becomes downregulated. So what happens is, we can see down here, we start out with a very sensitive CB1 receptor, and in response to cannabis, we reduce the number of receptors on the cell surfaces, and so the cell becomes less responsive to the endogenous signals AEA and 2AG. So by downregulating CB1 receptor, we can kind of oppose the effects of omega-6 fatty acids. So that's summarized here. So we've got our diet over here, and it stimulates and causes us to produce more AEA and 2AG. And that's going to stimulate CB1 receptor and lead to weight gain. And then cannabis use in the acute stage, when you've got the munchies basically, will stimulate CB1 receptor and cause increased caloric intake. But over the long term, it causes a downregulation of CB1 receptor. So our CB1 receptor is now less responsive to these signals, and weight gain is reduced. So I've summarized that over here. Here's our CB1 receptor activity prior to use. There's a big stimulation when cannabis is consumed, but then that's followed by reduced activity due to downregulation of the receptor. And so overall effect is reduced activity of that CB1 receptor. So we've got a theory now that goes all the way from our disrupted diet that's obesogenic to the way that cannabis reduces obesity. And there's strong evidence for each step in this process. There's strong evidence that obesity rates and metabolic syndrome are increasing with changes in diet. There's strong evidence that these shifts include a change to a higher omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. There's strong evidence that this shift increases endocannabinoid tone by increasing AEA and 2AG levels, and that overstimulates CB1 receptor. Strong evidence that overstimulation of CB1 receptor increases obesity and metabolic syndrome. Strong evidence that these are associated with numerous chronic diseases, including the main causes of death in the U.S. Strong evidence that a pharmacological decrease in CB1 receptor activity will increase metabolic rate and cause weight loss, but it causes also severe psychiatric side effects. There's strong evidence, though, that cannabis results in downregulation of CB1 receptor, which reduces CB1 receptor activity and does not have severe psychiatric side effects, at least in most people. And we have strong evidence that cannabis users have lower body mass index and obesity than non-users. So any theory should enable you to make predictions, and those predictions can then be used to test the theory. It turns out that the main prediction here is that when someone uses cannabis and then stops, their withdrawal symptoms will include weight loss. And the reason for that is because the CB1 receptor density is still downregulated for some time afterwards. And so the metabolic rate is increased and the reduced energy storage because of that, but they no longer are stimulating CB1 receptor whenever they use marijuana, and so they don't get the munchies anymore, so their overall caloric intake has gone down, and that will lead to weight loss. Well, this prediction is supported. It turns out that the DSM-4 list of cannabis withdrawal symptoms includes weight loss. So, from this theory, we can predict that we should be able to help at least some people with obesity with a therapy that includes cannabis. It has to be the THC though, because that's what activates the CB1 receptor. So over here, we've got our dietary dysregulation with our elevated omega-6, omega-3 ratio. Leads to elevated endocannabinoid signals, overstimulation of CB1 receptor, and weight gain. Well, we can target this in two ways. We can add omega-3 fatty acids, which causes these enzymes to produce less of these signals. So we see that over here. If we add omega-3 fatty acid supplements, we have a more balanced omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, which reduces our endocannabinoid signals. And then if we use cannabis, we downregulate CB1 receptor, and so we have both less signal and less responsiveness to that signal, and that should lead to weight loss. It turns out, though, that we don't need to use cannabis on a daily basis. It can be weekly, is enough to keep the CB1 receptor downregulated and contribute to weight loss. So I'm proposing weekly cannabis use, daily omega-3 supplements as a way to promote weight loss and alleviate many of these diseases that are associated with obesity. So thank you for your time.